The doors of the great hall closed with a sound like a struck drum, and Alira felt the cold reach her before she understood what was happening. One moment, she had been standing beside her new husband, Cale Draven, the Alpha King of the Northern Ridge Pack, her hand still trembling from the weight of the ring he had placed on her finger only hours before. The next moment, 4 guards in dark cloaks were guiding her away from the warmth of the fire, away from the music, away from the crowd of wolves who had watched her marry their king with expressions she could not read. She thought, at first, that this was simply part of the ceremony. She had been told there were traditions she did not understand yet, customs of the pack that a human-born bride like her would need to learn. She did not expect the traditions to include being left outside in the snow. "This way, my lady," one of the guards said, his voice flat, almost bored, as if he were leading a servant to a storage room, and not a queen to her chambers. Alira followed, because she did not know what else to do. The stone corridors of Draven Castle were unfamiliar to her, twisting and turning past torches that threw long shadows on the walls, and she had arrived only 2 days earlier, brought north by a caravan of soldiers who spoke little and smiled less. The guards led her through a side door, out into a wide stone courtyard where the wind cut sharp, and the snow had already begun to pile against the walls. Alira stopped walking. "My chambers are inside," she said carefully. "Are they not?" The tallest of the guards, a broad man with a scar across his jaw, looked at her the way one might look at an insect that had wandered somewhere it did not belong. "The Alpha King's bride must prove her strength before she enters his home," he said. "It is the old way. Every Luna before you has done the same." Alira had heard of pack customs that tested new mates, small rituals meant to honor old traditions, nothing more than symbolic gestures usually completed quickly, with warmth and celebration waiting just beyond. She searched the guard's face for some sign that this was one of those gentle customs, a formality, to be finished in minutes. She found no such sign. "How long must I stay?" she asked. "Until the king sends for you," the guard said, and then he turned, and the other 3 followed him, and the heavy door shut behind them, with a sound of iron sliding into place. Alira stood alone in the courtyard, as the first true gust of the night wind hit her, cutting through the thin silk of her wedding gown, as if it were nothing at all. She had chosen the gown herself, back in her home village of Ashcombe, 3 weeks before the wedding, when she had still believed this marriage might be something she could survive with her dignity intact. It was pale blue, embroidered with small silver threads at the collar, beautiful for a warm hall filled with candlelight. It was nothing at all against a northern winter night. She pressed her arms against her body and looked around for any door, any window, any way back inside. The courtyard was walled on all 4 sides, tall gray stone rising up into darkness, with a single iron gate on the far side that was chained shut. Somewhere above her, she could hear the faint sound of music still drifting from the hall, laughter, voices raised in celebration. Her wedding celebration, happening without her. She told herself this would not last long. Someone would notice she was missing. Cale would notice. He was, after all, the Alpha King, a man whose senses were said to be sharper than any human's, who could hear a whisper 3 rooms away, and smell fear on a stranger, before they spoke a single word. Surely a king so powerful would notice his own bride was missing from her own wedding. She did not yet know that the guards who led her outside answered to someone else entirely. Celine stood at the edge of the great hall, half hidden behind a marble pillar, watching the door where Alira had disappeared with a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. She had been born into the pack, raised alongside Cale since they were pups running through the same forests, trained in the same halls, promised to each other in ways that were never formal, but were understood by everyone who mattered. She had expected to become Luna. She had expected the pack elders to arrange her marriage to Cale the moment he came of age to rule. Instead, a treaty had been signed between 2 kingdoms who did not trust each other, and Cale's father, before his death, had promised his son's hand to whichever human bride the neighboring kingdom of Hollowmere sent north, as a gesture of peace between wolf and man. Alira had been that bride, a stranger, an outsider with no wolf blood in her veins, no claws, no strength, nothing but a soft human body that could not survive a northern winter night without shelter. Celine had not created this situation, but she had certainly made sure it would happen exactly as it was happening now. "She will not last until midnight," said a voice beside her. It was Pharaoh, one of the pack elders, a thin, gray-haired man whose loyalty to Celine's family ran deeper than his loyalty to any treaty. The girl has no fur to protect her, no wolf blood to warm her from the inside. She will last long enough to understand her place, Celine said quietly. That is all I require. And if she does not survive the lesson? Celine's eyes flickered toward the door one final time, before she turned back toward the celebration, toward the music and the wine and the warmth she intended to keep for herself. Then, the king will need a new bride, she said. And this time, the pack elders will choose more carefully. Inside the courtyard, Illyra had begun to understand that no one was coming. She walked the perimeter of the walls twice, searching for any gap, any loose stone, any way to escape the open sky. She found nothing. The gate remained chained. The single door she had entered through remained sealed from the other side, and when she pressed her palm against the iron, banging twice, 3 times, calling out for someone, anyone, to hear her, the only answer was the wind howling back at her through the narrow space between the towers. She thought of her mother, who had died 2 winters before this one, and who had once told her that fear was only useful if it moved you toward safety. Fear that only made you freeze, her mother used to say, was fear wasted. Illyra pressed her back against the stone wall, out of the direct wind, and pulled her arms tighter around herself, and reminded herself, again and again, that panic would only make the cold feel worse. She thought of home. Ashcombe was a small village at the edge of the Hollowmere kingdom, built along a river that never fully froze even in the coldest months, and she had grown up believing that winter was simply something you endured, with a good fire and warm bread, and the people you loved close beside you. She had never imagined winter as something that could kill a person slowly, quietly, without any weapon at all, beyond the simple absence of warmth. She had agreed to this marriage because her father, a minor lord with debts he could not repay, had needed the treaty with the Northern Ridge Pack to survive politically. She had agreed because refusing would have meant war, or worse, would have meant watching her father lose everything he had built. She had told herself, in the weeks leading up to the wedding, that a marriage of convenience could still become something bearable, even something good, if she was patient and clever, and willing to learn the customs of a world she did not understand. She had not expected her first lesson in those customs to be delivered by the cold itself. An hour passed, perhaps 2. Illyra lost track of time, the way a person loses track of pain, when it becomes constant instead of sharp, a dull ringing sensation that had started in her fingers and toes, and was slowly working its way up her arms and legs. She kept moving, small steps back and forth along the same stretch of wall, because she remembered someone once telling her that stillness was dangerous in the cold, that the body needed motion to keep the blood moving to places that mattered. She thought about calling out again, but her voice had grown hoarse, and she suspected that even if someone heard her, they would not come. The guards who had led her outside had spoken with the certainty of people following orders they had received many times before. This was not an accident, this was not an oversight, someone had planned this, carefully, and Illyra was beginning to understand that surviving the night might depend entirely on her own strength, and nothing else. High above the courtyard, in a narrow window cut into the eastern tower, a young servant girl named Mira paused while carrying an armful of firewood, and looked down at the pale shape moving slowly along the courtyard wall. Mira was 16 years old, the daughter of a woman who had served the Draven family for 3 decades, and she had grown up hearing stories about the old traditions of the pack, the tests of strength given to new mates, the trials meant to prove a person's worth before they were welcomed fully into pack life. But those stories had always described trials that lasted an hour, perhaps 2, always supervised, always ending with warmth and celebration. She had never heard of a trial that left a bride alone, in a locked courtyard, during the coldest night of the year, with no one watching to make sure she survived it. Mira set down her firewood and pressed her face closer to the narrow window, squinting through the darkness and the falling snow. The shape below was moving slower now than it had been moments before. Even from this distance, even through the glass in the night, Mira could see that something was deeply wrong. She thought immediately of finding help, but she did not know who to trust. The guards who had escorted the new Luna outside were loyal to Celine's family, and everyone in the servants' quarters knew better than to cross people with that kind of influence. The pack elders who might have intervened were, as far as Mira knew, either unaware of what was happening, or complicit in allowing it, and the king himself, the one person whose word could end this immediately, was somewhere in the castle, attending to matters far removed from his own courtyard. Mira stood at the window for a long moment, torn between fear and the simple, undeniable knowledge that a woman was dying slowly just below her, and no one else seemed to care. Then she picked up her skirts and ran. She did not run toward the guards, and she did not run toward the pack elders. She ran toward the one place in the castle where she thought she might find someone who could reach the king directly, someone whose loyalty could not be bought or threatened away, someone who had served the Draven family long enough to remember what honor was supposed to look like. She ran toward the king's private study, where his second-in-command, a broad-shouldered wolf named Callan, was known to work late into the night reviewing pack matters that required his attention before morning. Down in the courtyard, Alira had stopped walking. She told herself it was only to catch her breath, only a moment's rest before she continued moving, but some quieter part of her mind understood that her body was beginning to shut down in small, deliberate stages, the way a house grows dark room by room when its fires go out one at a time. Her fingers no longer felt like her own. The silk of her gown, once soft against her skin, now felt like a sheet of ice, pressed directly against her body. Her thoughts had begun to slow, becoming strange and slippery, drifting toward memories of warmth she could no longer feel. She thought of her father's hearth, the one from her childhood, where she used to sit close enough to feel the heat on her cheeks, while her mother told her stories about brave women in old legends, who survived impossible things through sheer will alone. She wondered, in a distant sort of way, whether she was one of those women, or whether she was simply a girl who had been sent north to marry a stranger and had now been left to die in his courtyard because his people did not want her there. She did not want to believe that Cale himself had chosen this for her. In the brief hours she had known him, standing beside him during the ceremony, she had seen little of the man beneath the crown, but she had not sensed cruelty in him, not the deliberate kind that would leave a bride freezing while music played inside. If anything, she had sensed a kind of distance, a man who had accepted this marriage the same way she had, as an obligation rather than a choice, but not one who wished her harm. She hoped she was right about that. She was not certain she would survive long enough to find out. Snow continued to fall, gathering in the folds of her gown, settling in her hair, and Alira slid slowly down the stone wall until she was sitting instead of standing, her knees pulled toward her chest, in a small, useless attempt to conserve whatever warmth remained inside her. She knew, somewhere in the clearer part of her mind, that sitting was dangerous, that she needed to keep moving, but her legs no longer seemed willing to obey the instructions her mind was sending them. Above her, the castle windows glowed gold and warm, filled with people who had no idea, or worse, who knew exactly what was happening and had chosen not to care. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, telling herself it was only to rest, only to gather whatever strength remained, and the wind continued to howl around the towers of Draven Castle, as if it too were trying to decide whether the new bride deserved to survive the night. Callan had been reviewing border reports for nearly an hour when the door to the king's study burst open without a knock, and a young servant girl he barely recognized stumbled inside, her face pale, her breath coming in short, frightened bursts. "Please," Mira said, before he could ask what she was doing there. "Please, you have to listen to me. The new Luna, she's outside. She's been outside for hours, and no one has let her back in." Callan set down the papers in his hand slowly, his expression unreadable in the way that career soldiers often trained themselves to appear, even when something inside them had gone cold with alarm. "Outside where?" "The east courtyard. The guards took her there after the ceremony. They said it was tradition, a trial, but no one has gone back for her, and it has been so long, and the snow, it's so heavy tonight, and I saw her from the tower window. She wasn't moving the same way anymore. She was—" "Which guards?" Callan interrupted, his voice sharpening. Mira gave him the description as best she could, the scarred jaw, the dark cloaks, and Callan's face shifted in a way that told her he already knew exactly who she was describing before she finished speaking. He knew the men. He knew whose orders they answered to when it mattered, regardless of whose uniform they wore during the day. "Where is the king now?" Mira asked. Callan's jaw tightened. "He left an hour ago to settle a dispute at the southern border outpost. A herder claimed wolves from a rival pack had crossed onto Draven land, It seemed urgent at the time. He paused, and something like understanding passed across his face, quiet and furious all at once. It was arranged to seem urgent. Someone wanted him away from the castle tonight. Mira felt her stomach twist. Then who do we tell? Me, Callan said, already moving toward the door, already reaching for the sword that hung near the entrance, out of old habit, rather than expectation of needing it. You did exactly the right thing coming to me. Now show me where you saw her. They moved quickly through the corridors, Callan's long strides forcing Mira into an uncomfortable half-run to keep pace, and as they passed through the great hall, still filled with music and laughter and wine, Callan's eyes swept briefly across the crowd, searching for the guards Mira had described, and finding, instead, Celine standing near the head table, with a cup of wine in her hand, and an expression of practiced calm that told him everything he needed to know about who had arranged this evening's cruelty. He did not stop to confront her. There would be time for that later, once the more urgent matter was resolved. Right now, every moment mattered more than it had a moment before, and Callan had spent enough years in the pack to know exactly how quickly a human body could fail in weather like tonight's. They reached the door leading to the east courtyard, and Callan found it locked, just as Mira had warned him it would be. A heavy iron bar dropped across the frame from the outside, clearly placed there to prevent exactly the kind of interference Callan was now attempting. He did not waste time searching for a key. Callan drove his shoulder into the door once, testing its weight, and on the second attempt, the old wood splintered around the iron bar, and the door swung inward with a crack that echoed through the corridor behind them. Cold air rushed in immediately, carrying with it the smell of snow and something else, something that made the fur along Callan's arms rise even beneath his shirt. He stepped into the courtyard and saw her. Elira sat slumped against the far wall, her pale gown nearly indistinguishable from the snow gathering around her, her dark hair dusted white, her body terrifyingly still. Callan crossed the courtyard in a handful of strides and knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers against the side of her neck, holding his breath, waiting for the faint pulse he desperately needed to find. It was there, weak, slow, but there. Get help, he said to Mira without turning around, his voice low and urgent. Find old Nora. Tell her to prepare the healing chamber immediately, and tell no one else why. Go now. Mira ran without hesitation, disappearing back through the broken doorway, and Callan shrugged off his own coat, laying it carefully over Elira's shoulders, doing what little he could to shield her from the wind, while he waited for the strength to move her safely, his mind already turning to how quickly he could carry her through the halls himself. He never had the chance. Hoofbeats thundered into the courtyard through the open iron gate, and Cale swung down from his horse before the animal had even fully stopped, his eyes finding the small, still shape against the wall in an instant, his entire body going rigid with a fear he had never felt in quite this way before. Move, he said to Callan, and there was nothing left of the composed king who had ridden out earlier that evening. His voice was raw, stripped down to something ancient, and furious, and afraid all at once. Callan stepped back immediately, and Cale dropped to his knees in the snow beside his wife, gathering her into his arms with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the barely restrained violence radiating from every other part of him. Her skin was so cold it startled him, cold in a way that felt wrong against his own overheated wolf's blood, and for one terrible moment he could not tell whether she was breathing at all. She has a pulse, Callan said quickly, understanding the question Cale could not force himself to ask aloud. Weak, but there. We need to get her warm, now. Cale lifted her against his chest, as though she weighed nothing at all, cradling her head carefully against his shoulder, and rose to his feet in one smooth motion. He did not wait for guidance. He did not wait for anyone else to lead the way. He carried her himself, through the broken doorway and into the warmth of the castle, moving faster than any servant or guard could match, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the pale, still face against his shoulder, as though looking away for even a moment might cost him everything. Word traveled fast, in a castle full of wolves, whose hearing missed very little, and by the time Cale strode through the corridors toward the lower halls, servants and guests alike pressed themselves against the walls to let him pass, staring in stunned silence at the sight of their king, carrying his unconscious bride through his own home, snow still melting from her hair, his expression promising that someone, somewhere, was going to answer for this. Old Nora was already waiting when Kale reached the healing chambers in the lower halls of the castle. Her sleeves rolled up, a fire built high in the hearth, thick blankets laid across a low bed near the flames. She had served 3 generations of Draven kings as healer, and she asked no questions as Kale laid Alira down carefully upon the bed, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary, as though he could not quite make himself let go. Nora's sharp eyes noted everything at once, the blue tint at the edges of the young woman's lips, the frost still clinging to strands of her hair, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. How long was she out there? Nora asked. Already working, already peeling away the ruined silk of the wedding gown, and replacing it with warm, dry cloth. Hours, Callan said from the doorway. Perhaps 4, maybe more. Nora's expression tightened. 4 hours in this cold would kill most men our own kind, let alone a human girl with no coat and nothing beneath silk. She pressed warmed cloths against Alira's hands and feet, careful and precise, murmuring instructions to the 2 younger healers who had appeared to assist her. Build the fire higher. Bring warm broth, not hot, warm, and be ready the moment she can swallow it. Kale did not move from the bedside. Tell me what she needs, and it will be done. Anything. What she needs now is time, and warmth, and quiet, Nora said, glancing up at him briefly. The rest depends on how much strength she had left before you found her. Mira stood near the doorway, watching the healers work, her hands twisted together in front of her. Guilt and relief tangled inside her chest, in equal measure. She had done what she could, she had found help in time, or at least she hoped she had. But the stillness of the woman on the bed frightened her in a way she had not expected, a reminder that even good intentions sometimes arrive at the very edge of being too late. Will she live? Mira asked quietly. Nora glanced up at her, her expression softening slightly at the fear in the girl's voice. She has a chance, the healer said. A real chance, thanks to you. But the next few hours will decide everything, and there is nothing more any of us can do now except keep her warm and wait. Kale's head turned sharply toward the servant girl standing near the door. Thanks to you, he repeated. Explain. Mira's throat went dry under the sudden weight of his attention, but she made herself speak, recounting everything. The tower window, the still shape in the snow, her run to find Callan, the locked door, the guards who had led the new Luna outside hours earlier and never returned. Kale listened without interrupting, and Callan, watching from the doorway, saw something settle behind the king's eyes, cold and absolute, the look of a man who had just heard the shape of a betrayal and was already beginning to trace its edges back toward whoever had drawn them. Guards, Kale said quietly, when Mira finished. Which guards? I did not see their faces clearly, my lord, Mira admitted. Only their cloaks, and the scar on one man's jaw. Garrett, Callan said at once. That is Garrett's mark. And Garrett does not act without instruction. Kale's gaze finally left the bed where his wife lay motionless beneath layers of warmed blankets, and when he looked up at Callan, the last traces of the composed king who had ridden out that evening were gone entirely. Find him, Kale said. Find every man who touched her tonight, and find whoever gave the order. I want names before dawn, and I want them delivered to me personally. Callan wasted no time. He gathered 3 trusted men, wolves who had served under him for years, and whose loyalty he had tested more than once, in circumstances far more dangerous than this. And together, they moved through the castle grounds searching for Garrett and the 3 guards who had escorted Alira into the courtyard hours before. They found Garrett in the barracks near the eastern wall, still dressed in the same dark cloak he had worn earlier that night, sharing a drink with 2 of the other guards involved. He looked up when Callan entered, and whatever confidence he had carried into the courtyard hours before drained visibly from his face the moment he saw the expression Callan wore. Second, Garrett said carefully, rising from his seat. Is something wrong? You know exactly what is wrong, Callan said. You left the new Luna outside in a locked courtyard for 4 hours in a winter storm. She very nearly died tonight. You will come with me now, and you will answer for it in front of the king. Garrett's eyes flicked toward the other 2 guards, searching for some shared plan, some agreement about what to say, but Callan's men were already closing the distance, and there would be no time for the guards to align their stories before they were separated and questioned one by one, exactly as Callan intended. It was tradition, Garrett said. though his voice had lost most of its earlier certainty. A trial for new mates. It has been done before. Not like this, Callan said. Not for 4 hours, in this cold, with no one watching to make sure she survived it. Whose order was this, Garrett? I will ask you only once more before I stop asking politely. Garrett's jaw worked silently for a moment before the words came out. Lady Selene, he said finally. She said it was the king's wish. She said he wanted the girl tested before he would accept her as Luna. Callan's expression did not change, though something in his eyes went colder. And you believe the king would ask you to nearly kill his own bride, rather than confirming his wishes with him directly? Garrett had no answer for that, and Callan did not wait for one. He motioned to his men, and the 3 guards were led away toward the castle's holding chambers, to be kept separately until the king decided what to do with them. Selene, meanwhile, had noticed the shift in the castle's mood the moment Cale strode past her in the great hall, without a single glance in her direction. His expression carved from stone, his pace suggesting urgency she had not expected him to feel for a bride he barely knew. She had assumed, in her planning, that even if Cale eventually learned what had happened, it would be hours before he acted, hours she could use to smooth the story into something more forgivable, an unfortunate accident rather than a deliberate cruelty. She had not accounted for how quickly a servant girl's courage could unravel careful plans. By the time Callan's men came for her, escorting her not to a holding cell, but to the king's private study, where Cale waited with an expression that made even the boldest members of his court reluctant to meet his eyes, Selene understood that her carefully arranged evening had already collapsed entirely. You wish to see me, she said, keeping her voice light as she entered the study, though her pulse had quickened the moment she saw his face. I wish to understand something, Cale said, not looking up from the papers on his desk, though Selene suspected he was not truly reading them at all. I left my own wedding celebration to settle a border dispute that turned out to be nothing more than an old, poorly made set of tracks. Tracks that led me nowhere, and accomplished nothing, except keeping me away from this castle for several hours. Border disputes happen, Selene said carefully. Herders are often mistaken. They are, Cale agreed, though it is a strange coincidence that this particular mistake happened on the one night when a bride I barely know needed to survive alone in a locked courtyard, with no one checking on her welfare for 4 hours. Selene's expression remained composed, though something behind her eyes flickered. I do not know what you are suggesting, my lord. Cale finally looked up, and the fury she saw there made her take an involuntary step backward. I am suggesting nothing, he said. Garrett has already confessed that the order came from you, that you told him it was my wish for my wife to be tested in the cold for hours on her wedding night. I would like to hear you explain why a woman I have known my entire life would believe I wanted my own bride, nearly killed, before I had even shared a single conversation with her. Selene's carefully maintained calm finally cracked, just slightly, at the edges. It was tradition, she said. The old trials have always tested new mates, to prove their strength, to ensure they belonged among us. I did not intend for her to be harmed. I only intended for her to understand her place. Her place, Cale repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. She is my wife. Her place is beside me, protected by everyone in this pack, exactly as any Luna's place has ever been. You did not test her strength tonight, Selene. You tried to remove an obstacle you resented, using a tradition you twisted far beyond anything it was ever meant to be, and you very nearly succeeded in killing an innocent woman to do it. Selene had no answer that would not condemn her further, and she remained silent, her chin lifted with what remained of her pride, though her eyes had begun to show the first traces of genuine fear. You will remain confined to your family's quarters until I decide what is to be done with you, Cale said, and you should understand, clearly, that if my wife does not survive the night, the punishment I choose will reflect exactly how close you came to costing her everything. Selene was led away without further protest, and Cale remained alone in his study for a long moment, staring at nothing, his hands pressed flat against the surface of his desk, as though he needed the solid weight of it to keep himself from shaking apart entirely. He had married Elira as an obligation, a treaty made real, a stranger he had expected to grow accustomed to slowly, over months or years, the way one grows accustomed to any unfamiliar arrangement. He had not expected to feel anything so immediate, so overwhelming, as the fear that had gripped him the moment he saw her still shape against the courtyard wall. He did not yet have a name for what he was feeling. He only knew that he needed to return to the healing chambers, and that he needed to see, with his own eyes, that she was still breathing. Down in the healing chambers, Illyra drifted in and out of a fevered half-sleep, caught somewhere between dreams and memory, unable to tell which images belonged to which. She saw her mother's face, warm and smiling in the firelight of their old home in Ashcombe. She saw the courtyard walls rising around her, gray and unforgiving. She saw a pair of eyes, sharp and golden, watching her from somewhere close, though she could not remember whose eyes they belonged to, or whether she had imagined them entirely. Old Nora worked steadily beside the bed, checking the color slowly returning to Illyra's fingers, listening to the strengthening rhythm of her breathing, murmuring quiet reassurances to Mira, who had refused to leave the room, despite Nora's gentle suggestions that she rest. "She is stronger than she looks," Nora said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Most humans would not have survived this long in that cold. She fought to stay alive, even when her body wanted to give up." Mira, sitting in a chair near the fire, hugged her knees to her chest, and watched the rise and fall of Illyra's chest, with an intensity that suggested she was silently willing each breath to continue. "Do you think she will forgive us?" she asked quietly, "for what happened to her here, in this place that was supposed to become her home?" Nora considered the question carefully before answering. "I think," she said, "that forgiveness will depend entirely on what happens next. Whether the people responsible are held accountable. Whether she is shown, clearly and repeatedly, that tonight was not who this pack truly is, but rather who a few cruel people within it chose to become." The door opened quietly, and Cale entered, his expression still carrying the weight of his confrontation with Celine, though it softened, just slightly, at the sight of Illyra resting more peacefully than she had when he last saw her. "How is she?" he asked, moving to stand at the foot of the bed. "Improving," Nora said. "Slowly, but improving. Her fever has not broken yet, but her breathing is steadier, and color is returning to her skin. If she continues this way through the night, I believe she will recover fully." Cale exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders for the first time since he had ridden back into the courtyard and found her lying motionless in the snow. "And Celine," he said, though the question was not truly for Nora, "I have confined her. I have not yet decided what punishment fits what she has done." "That is a decision only you can make," Nora said carefully, "though I would suggest waiting until your wife wakes and hears the truth from your own mouth before you decide anything final. She deserves that much, at least, after tonight." Cale nodded slowly, his eyes returning to Illyra's face, still pale but no longer carrying the terrible stillness he had found in the courtyard. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, and Nora, recognizing when her presence was no longer needed, quietly excused herself to check on other matters, leaving Mira dozing in her chair by the fire, and Cale alone with his sleeping wife, for the first time since their wedding had ended so terribly. He studied her face in the firelight, searching for some sense of the woman beneath the crown he had placed on her only hours before, and found himself wondering, for the first time since the treaty had been arranged, what kind of person she truly was, beneath the polite composure she had shown during their brief ceremony. He did not yet know that she would wake with questions of her own, questions about a king who had married her out of obligation, and then arrived, furious and desperate, to carry her out of the snow himself. Illyra woke slowly, the way a person surfaces from deep water, aware first of warmth pressing against her skin from every direction, then of the crackle of a fire nearby, and finally of the dull ache that seemed to have settled into every part of her body at once. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, or why her thoughts felt so slow and heavy, like wading through mud. Then the memory returned all at once. The courtyard, the cold, the long hours of waiting for a rescue that never seemed to come. She opened her eyes and found herself in an unfamiliar room, lit by firelight, wrapped in blankets so thick she could barely move beneath their weight. And beside the bed, in a chair that looked far too small for his frame, sat Cale, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You are awake," he said quietly, as though he could not quite believe it himself. "How long?" she managed, her voice hoarse and unfamiliar even to her own ears. 2 days, Cale said. "You have been asleep, mostly. though Nora says that was the fever working itself out of your body. She says you are healing well, better than she expected, given how long you were left outside. Alira absorbed this slowly, piecing together fragments of memory with the information he had just given her. The courtyard, she said. Someone locked the door. I called out, but no one came. I know, Cale said, and something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. His expression carried a weight she had not expected. Guilt layered beneath anger, both aimed, she realized slowly. Not at her, but at himself. I was not here. I was drawn away by a false report, deliberately, so that I would not be present to notice you were missing. By the time I returned and understood what had happened, you had already been outside for hours. Who did this? Alira asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, involved the woman she had noticed watching her throughout the wedding ceremony, with an expression that had nothing warm in it at all. Celine, Cale said. A woman I grew up with, who believed she should have become my wife instead of you. She ordered the guards to leave you outside, and she arranged for me to be elsewhere so that no one would intervene in time. Alira absorbed this in silence for a long moment, and Cale watched her carefully, uncertain what reaction to expect. Anger, perhaps. Tears. A demand for immediate and severe punishment against the woman who had nearly cost her life. Instead, Alira simply asked, "What happens to her now?" "That depends," Cale said carefully, "on what you wish to happen. She has been confined since that night. I have not yet decided her punishment, because I believed you deserved to have a voice in that decision, given that it was your life she endangered." Alira considered this for a long moment, staring up at the ceiling above her, gathering her thoughts before she spoke again. "I do not know your customs well enough to say what punishment fits what she did," she said finally, "but I know that if she is allowed to remain in a position where she could try something like this again, I will never feel safe in this castle. Whatever you decide, I need to know that this cannot happen to me, or to anyone else, ever again." "It will not," Cale said, and there was a certainty in his voice that left no room for doubt. "I intend to make sure of that personally." Alira studied his face, searching for the coldness she had expected from a man who had accepted this marriage as nothing more than a political obligation, and found instead something she had not anticipated at all, a raw and genuine concern that seemed to have grown, somehow, in the space of a single terrible night. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked quietly. "We are strangers. This marriage was arranged for reasons that had nothing to do with either of us choosing each other. You could have simply requested a new bride. If I had not survived, it would have been easier." Cale was quiet for a long moment before he answered, choosing his words carefully, as though he were still discovering the truth of them even as he spoke. "I expected this marriage to be exactly what you describe," he admitted. "An arrangement. A duty. I did not expect to feel what I felt when I found you in that courtyard, when I thought, for one terrible moment, that I had already lost you before I had even had the chance to know you at all." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "I do not fully understand it myself. But I know that I do not wish to lose you, Alira. Not to the cold, and not to anyone in this castle who believes they have the right to decide whether you deserve to survive." Alira felt something shift inside her chest at his words, something cautious and uncertain, but no longer entirely afraid. She had expected, in the days leading up to her wedding, that she would spend years learning to tolerate a husband who saw her as nothing more than a political necessity. She had not expected to find, instead, a man whose fury on her behalf had been fierce enough to end a wedding celebration and confine a lifelong friend within hours. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for coming back for me." "I should never have left in the first place," Cale said. "That is a mistake I intend to spend a very long time correcting." Over the following days, as Alira's strength slowly returned under Nora's careful attention, Cale visited her chambers each morning and evening, at first to check on her recovery, and gradually, as the days passed, simply because he found himself wanting to. Their conversations, awkward and formal at first, slowly began to shift into something easier, something that resembled the beginning of an understanding neither of them had expected to find in an arranged marriage born from political necessity. Alira learned that Cale had become Alpha King at a young age, after his father's sudden death, and had spent the years since navigating a court full of people who questioned his authority at every turn. testing him in small ways that had taught him to keep most of his emotions carefully guarded. Kale learned that Alira had grown up caring for a father who struggled beneath the weight of debts and poor decisions, and had agreed to this marriage not out of any romantic hope, but out of a fierce desire to protect her family from the consequences of her father's failures. Neither of them had expected honesty to come so easily, once the barriers of formality began to fall away. Meanwhile, Callan continued his investigation into the full scope of what had happened on the night of the wedding, uncovering, slowly, that Celine's cruelty ran deeper than a single impulsive decision. He discovered that she had been planning some version of this scheme for weeks, ever since the treaty naming Alira as Kale's bride had first been announced, gathering allies among pack members who resented the idea of a human Luna, building a network of support that she had believed would protect her from consequences, even if her plan were discovered. That network, Callan learned, included Pharaoh, the pack elder who had watched from beside Celine as the guards led Alira into the courtyard, and at least 2 other members of the pack council whose loyalty to tradition ran deeper than their loyalty to their king. This was not the impulsive cruelty of one jealous woman, Callan reported to Kale, several days after the wedding, as they reviewed the growing list of names connected to the scheme. This was a coordinated effort, involving people with real influence in this pack, all of whom believed a human bride did not deserve the protection owed to any Luna. Kale's expression darkened as he studied the list. Then the punishment cannot simply address Celine alone, he said. If I allow the others to escape consequences, I send a message to every wolf in this pack that cruelty toward my wife carries no real cost, so long as enough people share the blame to spread it thin. What do you intend to do? Callan asked. Kale was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of the decision ahead of him, understanding that whatever he chose would define, in the eyes of his entire pack, exactly what kind of king he intended to be, and exactly what kind of protection his wife could expect from him going forward. I intend to make an example, he said finally, that no one in this castle will ever forget. The gathering was called for the 7th evening after the wedding, when Alira had regained enough strength to stand on her own for short periods of time, though Nora had insisted she remain seated for the proceedings, wrapped in warm furs against a chill that no longer threatened her life, but still made her shiver at unexpected moments, a lingering reminder of the night she had nearly died. The Great Hall, the same room where her wedding celebration had taken place only a week before, had been transformed for a very different purpose. The pack council sat along one side, their expressions ranging from grim anticipation to poorly hidden anxiety, depending on how closely their own actions connected to the events under review. Celine stood before them, flanked by 2 guards, her composure held together by little more than stubborn pride at this point. Pharaoh stood a short distance away, along with 2 other council members Callan's investigation had implicated, each of them refusing to meet the eyes of the king, seated at the head of the hall. Kale rose slowly, and the hall fell silent immediately, every wolf present understanding that whatever happened in the next few minutes would shape the rest of their lives within this pack. 7 nights ago, Kale began, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, I married a woman sent to this pack as part of a treaty meant to secure peace between our people and the kingdom of Hollowmere. On that same night, while I was deliberately misled away from this castle, my wife was led into the eastern courtyard and left there, locked outside, for over 4 hours, in temperatures that nearly killed her. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the assembled council before continuing. I have spent the past week learning exactly how this happened, and exactly who is responsible. What I discovered was not the impulsive cruelty of a single jealous woman, though Celine's role in ordering this act cannot be forgiven or excused. What I discovered was a coordinated effort, involving multiple members of this council, all of whom believed that a human bride did not deserve the same protection owed to any Luna who has ever stood beside a Draven king. Pharaoh shifted uncomfortably where he stood, and Kale's gaze settled on him directly. Pharaoh, Kale said, you watched from beside Celine as my wife was led outside. You knew what was planned, and you said nothing, did nothing, to prevent it. Do you deny this? Pharaoh's throat worked silently for a moment before he answered. I did not believe the girl would come to true harm, my lord. I believed it was merely a test of endurance, as such trials have always been. A test of endurance lasting 4 hours, in a winter storm, with no one monitoring her condition, Kale said flatly. You are old enough to remember what such trials have traditionally looked like, Pharaoh. You know this was nothing like tradition. This was cruelty, dressed in the language of custom, and you allowed it to proceed because you shared Celine's belief that my wife's survival mattered less than her own comfort. He turned his attention to the full council, his voice hardening further. I am the Alpha King of this pack. My authority exists to protect every member of this territory, and that protection extends, absolutely, to my wife, regardless of where she was born or what blood runs through her veins. What happened 7 nights ago was not tradition. It was an attempted murder, disguised as ceremony, and I will not allow it to be treated as anything less. Elira, seated near the front of the hall, watched Cale speak with an authority she had not yet witnessed from him, a certainty that left no room for negotiation or excuse, and felt something settle within her chest that resembled, for the first time since her arrival at Draven Castle, a genuine sense of safety. Celine, Cale continued, turning back toward the woman who had once been among his closest companions. You ordered guards to leave my wife outside, knowing the danger she faced. You arranged for me to be deliberately misled away from this castle, ensuring no one would intervene in time to save her. Had Callan and a servant girl named Mira not acted with more courage and honor than every member of this council combined, my wife would be dead, and you would have achieved exactly what you intended. Celine's composure finally broke, just slightly, though whether from fear or genuine remorse, no one in the hall could say with certainty. I did not want her dead, she said quietly. I only wanted her to understand that she did not belong here, that this place was never meant to be hers. She belongs here because I chose her as my wife, Cale said, his voice carrying an edge that silenced any further protest. And you will spend the rest of your days understanding exactly how severe the consequences are for anyone who threatens what belongs to me. He announced Celine's punishment then. Banishment from Draven territory, permanent and absolute, stripped of her title and her standing within the pack, forbidden from ever returning to lands under Cale's protection. Pharaoh and the other implicated council members received similar sentences, though with somewhat reduced severity given their more passive roles in the scheme. Banishment for a period of years rather than permanently, with clear warning that any attempt to return early would be met with far harsher consequences. The guards who had physically carried out the abandonment, Garrett among them, faced their own separate judgment, stripped of their positions and sentenced to hard labor at the pack's northern outposts, a punishment severe enough to demonstrate the seriousness of their crime without extending to the permanent banishment reserved for those who had orchestrated the scheme itself. As the guards led the condemned from the hall, murmurs rippled through the assembled council, and Elira could sense, watching the reactions around her, that something fundamental had shifted in how this pack understood its king, and understood, by extension, what it meant that a human woman now stood beside him as Luna. Cale returned to his seat beside Elira once the hall had emptied of everyone except his most trusted advisors, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had happened settling over them both in the sudden quiet. Do you believe justice was served? Cale asked finally, watching her carefully. Elira considered the question seriously before answering. I believe you did what you believed was right, she said, and I believe, for the first time since I arrived here, that I might actually be safe in this place. She paused, studying his face in the firelight. That matters more to me than whether the punishment was harsh enough to satisfy anger. I do not want vengeance, Cale. I only wanted to survive, and to know it will not happen again. It will not, Cale said, and this time, having watched him deliver judgment before the full pack council with such unwavering authority, Elira believed him completely. But even as the council dispersed and the immediate crisis seemed resolved, Callan remained troubled by something he had uncovered during his investigation, a detail he had not yet shared with the king, uncertain whether it represented genuine danger or merely the paranoid ramblings of a guard, desperate to reduce his own punishment. One of Garrett's fellow guards, in the hours before his sentencing, had mentioned, almost in passing, that Celine had spoken with someone outside the pack in the weeks before the wedding, a contact from beyond Draven territory who had expressed interest in the outcome of Elira's arrival, someone whose motives seemed to extend beyond simple jealousy over a lost engagement. Callan intended to investigate this thread carefully before bringing it to Cale's attention, uncertain whether it represented a genuine threat or merely a desperate guard's attempt to shift blame elsewhere. He did not yet know how urgently that investigation would need to move, or how much danger still lingered beyond the walls of Draven Castle, waiting for an opportunity that Celine's banishment had not entirely closed off. Callan found the guard, a nervous young man named Otto, in the holding chambers the following morning, and pressed him for more details about the contact Celine had supposedly met before the wedding. "I do not know his name," Otto admitted, clearly hoping that cooperation might soften whatever punishment awaited him. "I only saw him once, from a distance, when I was posted near the northern gate. He wore no pack colors, and he did not speak like anyone from Draven territory. Lady Celine met him near the old mill, outside the castle walls, and they spoke for perhaps an hour before he rode away toward the eastern hills." "The eastern hills lead toward Hollowmere," Callan said slowly, a cold certainty beginning to settle over him. "I do not know where he came from," Otto said. "I only know that after that meeting, Lady Celine seemed different, more confident, as though she had gained some assurance that her plans would succeed without lasting consequence." Callan brought this information to Cale immediately, and the two men sat together in the king's study, turning the implications over carefully, aware that if their suspicions proved accurate, the danger to Alira had never truly ended with Celine's banishment. "If someone from Hollowmere encouraged Celine's scheme," Cale said slowly, "then the goal was never simply to remove Alira from my life. The goal was to damage the treaty itself, to create exactly the kind of incident that could unravel peace between our territories and plunge us back into conflict. A conflict that would benefit certain factions within Hollowmere far more than continued peace," Callan agreed. "Alira's father accepted this treaty to protect his lands from war, but not everyone in Hollowmere's court shares his preference for peace. There are those who profit from conflict, who see continued tension between wolf and human territories as more valuable than any treaty. And if Celine believed she had support from within Hollowmere itself," Cale said, "then her banishment may not end this threat. It may simply relocate it." They agreed to increase security around Alira immediately, doubling the guards assigned to her chambers, restricting her movements outside the castle until the full scope of the threat could be understood. Alira, when informed of these new precautions, absorbed the news with a calm that surprised Cale, though he could see, beneath her composed exterior, the same fear that had gripped her during her long night in the courtyard. "I thought this was over," she said quietly, standing near the window of her chambers, watching snow fall gently outside, so different now from the storm that had nearly killed her. "I hoped it was," Cale admitted. "But I would rather protect you against a threat that may not fully materialize than fail to protect you against one that does. I have already lost you once to carelessness. I do not intend to make that mistake again." 3 days later, Callan's caution proved justified. A messenger arrived at Draven Castle, claiming to carry urgent correspondence from Alira's father in Hollowmere, requesting a private audience with the new Luna to discuss matters related to the treaty's implementation. The request seemed reasonable enough on its surface, and under ordinary circumstances, Alira would have welcomed the chance to hear from her father directly. But Callan, reviewing the messenger's credentials with the heightened suspicion the past week had taught him to maintain, noticed inconsistencies in the seal used on the correspondence, subtle differences from the seal Alira's father had used on previous letters, differences that suggested forgery rather than genuine authorship. "This is not from your father," Callan told Alira and Cale, laying the letter and an authentic sample side by side for comparison. "The seal has been copied, but imperfectly. Someone wanted this to appear legitimate enough to secure a private audience with you, away from the protection of the castle." Alira felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. "Then this is the threat you suspected," she said. "Someone is still trying to reach me." "It appears so," Cale said grimly. "Which means whoever orchestrated this understands that direct confrontation within the castle will fail, and has decided instead to lure you into a situation where our protection cannot reach you as easily. They devised a careful plan together, one that would allow them to identify and capture whoever had sent the false messenger, without placing Alira in genuine danger. Alira would appear to agree to the requested audience, arranged to take place at a meeting point outside the castle walls, while Cale and a contingent of his most trusted guards would follow at a careful distance, close enough to intervene the moment any threat became clear, but far enough to avoid alerting whoever waited to spring their trap. I do not like this plan, Kale admitted, as they finalized the details the evening before the arranged meeting. I do not like placing you anywhere near danger again, regardless of how carefully we prepare. I understand the risk, Elira said. But if we do not draw this threat into the open now, it may simply wait for another opportunity, one we might not anticipate, as clearly as we can anticipate this one. I would rather face this danger with you beside me, than spend the rest of my life wondering when the next attempt might come. Kale studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression that had nothing to do with strategy or danger, something that spoke instead to how much his understanding of her had grown in the weeks since their wedding. You are braver than I expected, he said quietly. I have had very little choice but to become brave, Elira said. Since the night I arrived in this castle, survival has demanded it of me constantly. The following afternoon, Elira traveled beyond the castle walls under heavy escort, though the escort remained carefully hidden from view as she approached the meeting point, an old stone bridge crossing a narrow river at the edge of Draven territory, chosen by the false messenger as the location for her supposed audience with her father's representative. She waited at the bridge as instructed, her heart pounding despite the outward calm she maintained, aware that Kale and his guards waited in the tree line nearby, close enough to reach her within moments if anything went wrong, but far enough that whoever approached would not immediately sense their presence. A figure emerged from the trees on the far side of the bridge, not the messenger who had delivered the false letter, but a tall man in unfamiliar dark clothing, moving with the careful, controlled gait of someone accustomed to danger. Elira recognized, with a sinking feeling, that this was not a diplomatic representative at all. Lady Elira, the man said, his voice carrying no warmth whatsoever. You came alone, as requested. That was wise. I was told my father wished to speak with me, Elira said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear building in her chest. Where is his representative? There is no representative, the man said. There is only the opportunity your continued survival has created for certain interested parties. You should not have survived that night in the courtyard. Your death would have served important purposes, purposes that your survival has unfortunately delayed rather than eliminated. Who sent you? Elira demanded, though some part of her already suspected the answer, connected to the shadowy contact Otto had described meeting with Celine weeks before the wedding. Someone who understands that peace between wolf and human territories serves only a narrow set of interests, the man said, while conflict serves a great many more. Your marriage was meant to secure that peace. Your death, arranged carefully enough to appear accidental, would have unraveled it just as effectively as the courtyard should have, had events unfolded as originally planned. He took a step forward, and Elira felt the full weight of the danger she had walked into settle over her, understanding, in that moment, exactly how vulnerable she remained, despite every precaution Kale had arranged. You will not leave this bridge, the man continued, and when your body is discovered, it will appear the tragic result of a fall, nothing more. No one will suspect involvement from anyone beyond this territory's own troubled politics. I do not think that will happen, Elira said, drawing on every ounce of courage she had gathered since her arrival at Draven Castle, because you have made the mistake of assuming I came here without protection. The man's confidence flickered, just slightly, and in that moment, Kale emerged from the tree line, his guards fanning out around the bridge with a speed and coordination that left the intruder no clear path of escape. You have made several mistakes tonight, Kale said, his voice carrying the same authority Elira had heard him use before the Pack Council days earlier. But perhaps the greatest was believing that anyone could threaten my wife within my own territory, without facing immediate and severe consequences. The intruder's hand moved toward a weapon concealed beneath his cloak, but Callan's guards closed the distance too quickly, subduing him before he could complete the motion, disarming him and forcing him to his knees on the cold stone of the bridge. Kale crossed to Elira immediately, his eyes searching her face for any sign of harm, his relief palpable, despite the tension still radiating from every line of his body. Are you hurt? He asked. No, Elira said, though her voice trembled slightly with the release of fear she had been holding carefully in check. I am not hurt. He did not touch me. Kale pulled her against him briefly, a gesture that surprised them both with its intensity, before turning his attention to the captured intruder, his expression hardening once again into the cold authority of a king protecting what belonged to him. You will tell us everything, Kale said. Who sent you, what they hope to accomplish, and every detail of the plan you and your associates have been building since before my wedding took place. You will tell us willingly, or you will tell us after considerably more persuasion. Either way, the truth will be known before this night ends. The captured man, who eventually gave his name as Dagon, proved less willing to talk than Cale had hoped, maintaining a stubborn silence through the first hour of questioning in the castle's lower chambers. It was only when Callan produced the forged letter, bearing the imperfect copy of Alira's father's seal, laying it on the table between them with quiet deliberation, that Dagon's composure finally began to crack. "You are not clever enough to have forged this alone," Callan said. "Someone taught you to copy that seal, someone with access to genuine correspondence from Holomir's court. That person is who we truly want, Dagon. Give us their name, and perhaps your own punishment reflects the difference between a hired hand and the mind that directed him." Dagon's eyes flicked toward Cale, weighing his options carefully, before he finally spoke. "Lord Edric," he said quietly, "younger brother to Alira's father, and heir to Holomir's throne, should anything happen to prevent the current line of succession from continuing peacefully." Alira, standing near the back of the chamber where she had insisted on being present for the interrogation, felt a fresh wave of shock pass through her. "My uncle," she said quietly. "He arranged this?" "Lord Edric believes the treaty with Draven territory threatens his own ambitions," Dagon continued, apparently having decided that full cooperation offered his best remaining chance for leniency. "Your father's line will inherit Holomir's throne through your future children, children who would carry both human and wolf blood, uniting the two territories in ways that would permanently end any hope Lord Edric holds of claiming the throne through more traditional means. Your death, arranged to appear accidental, would eliminate that possibility entirely, while also creating exactly enough tension between our territories to justify the kind of conflict that would keep both kingdoms too distracted to notice Lord Edric consolidating power within Holomir's own court." The full scope of the conspiracy settled over the chamber in heavy silence. This had never been simply about Celene's jealousy, or pack politics within Draven territory. Alira's very existence, and the treaty her marriage represented, had threatened ambitions reaching far beyond anything she had imagined when she first agreed to leave her home in Ashcombe. Lord Edric approached Lady Selene, weeks before the wedding, Dagon continued, recognizing her resentment toward the arranged marriage, and offering resources, information, and assurance of protection if her efforts to eliminate the new Luna succeeded. When the courtyard scheme failed, he activated a secondary plan, myself included, to complete what Selene's efforts had begun. Cale's expression had grown increasingly grim throughout Dagon's confession, and when the man finished speaking, the king turned to Callan with quiet, controlled fury. "We need to warn Alira's father immediately," he said. "If Lord Edric is willing to arrange his niece's death to secure his own claim to the throne, there is no reason to believe he would hesitate to move against his own brother as well, once this scheme's failure becomes apparent to him." A messenger was dispatched to Holomir that same night, carrying urgent warning of Lord Edric's treachery, along with detailed evidence gathered from Dagon's confession, evidence that would allow Alira's father to move against his brother, before Edric could learn that his plan had failed, and attempt some more desperate action to salvage his ambitions. The following days passed in tense uncertainty, as Draven Castle awaited word from Holomir, Alira remaining under heightened guard despite Dagon's capture, aware that Lord Edric himself remained free and potentially dangerous, until confirmation arrived that he had been stopped. That confirmation came 8 days later, in the form of a letter from Alira's father himself, its seal genuine and unmistakable this time, describing how Lord Edric had been confronted with the evidence of his treachery and had attempted to flee Holomir's capital rather than face judgment for his crimes. He had been captured at the border, attempting to cross into a neighboring territory known for harboring exiled nobility, and now awaited trial for conspiracy and treason against the crown he had hoped to claim through his niece's death. Alira read the letter twice, sitting beside the fire in what had gradually become her favorite corner of the castle's private study, before finally allowing herself to fully absorb the reality that the danger, at last, had genuinely ended. "It is over," she said quietly, looking up at Cale, who had been reading the letter over her shoulder. "Truly over, this time." "It appears so," Cale agreed, though she could hear the careful relief in his voice, the same caution that had marked every step of the investigation since the night in the courtyard. Your father writes that Edric's trial will proceed according to Holomir's laws, and that he intends to strengthen the treaty between our territories further, as a demonstration that this conspiracy has only reinforced the importance of the peace your marriage represents, rather than weakening it as Edric had hoped. Illyra set the letter aside and looked around the study, taking in details she had grown familiar with over the past weeks: the worn leather of the chairs, the smell of old books and wood smoke, the particular quality of afternoon light through the tall windows. It struck her, in that quiet moment, that this castle, which had nearly killed her on the very first night she arrived, had somehow become something that felt increasingly like home. "Kale," she said, and something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. "I think I am ready to stop thinking of this place as somewhere I was sent, and start thinking of it as somewhere I choose to remain." Kale's expression shifted into something she had rarely seen from him, a softness that seemed almost unfamiliar on features more accustomed to command and authority. "I would like that very much," he said quietly. "Though I understand if trust takes longer to rebuild than a single conversation allows." "Trust is built through actions, not conversations," Illyra said. "And you have shown me, repeatedly, over these past weeks, exactly what kind of protection I can expect from you. That matters more than any words could." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling steadily beside them, and Illyra found herself thinking back to the night of her wedding, to the terror of the locked courtyard, and the endless cold, and marveling at how far she had traveled, in every sense, from that frightened woman huddled against stone walls with no one coming to help her. Everyone had come, eventually. Mira, with her quiet courage, Callan, with his relentless investigation, and Kale, who had ridden through the night to carry her from the snow himself, and who had spent every day since proving, through actions rather than empty promises, that she belonged in his life as fully and completely as any Luna who had come before her. Winter deepened across Draven territory in the weeks that followed, and with it came a new kind of test for Illyra, one that had nothing to do with conspiracies or courtyard cruelty, but with something far more ordinary and, in its own way, far more demanding of her. A severe blizzard swept down from the northern mountains, far worse than the storm that had nearly claimed her life on her wedding night, burying the villages scattered across Draven territory beneath drifts of snow that made travel nearly impossible. Word reached the castle that a village near the eastern border, a small settlement called Hollow Pines, had lost access to its usual supply routes, and that several families, including young children, were running dangerously low on food and firewood as the storm showed no sign of weakening. Kale immediately began organizing relief efforts, gathering supplies and volunteers willing to brave the dangerous conditions to reach the isolated village, and Illyra, watching the preparations with growing determination, made a decision that surprised nearly everyone in the castle. "I want to go with the relief party," she announced, finding Kale in the midst of coordinating supply wagons in the castle's main courtyard. Kale turned to her with an expression that mixed concern and confusion in equal measure. "The conditions are severe," he said carefully. "Given what happened to you during the last storm, I would understand if you wish to remain here, where it is warm and safe." "That is precisely why I want to go," Illyra said. "I know what it feels like to face that kind of cold without help arriving in time. I cannot simply remain comfortable here while children in Hollow Pines face something similar. Besides," she added, "I grew up in a village not so different from Hollow Pines. I know things about surviving harsh winters that your wolves, accustomed to relying on their own fur and strength, may not have considered." Kale studied her for a long moment, weighing his instinct to protect her against his growing respect for her determination, before finally nodding. "You will remain close to me at all times," he said, "and you will tell me immediately if the cold becomes too much for you to bear safely." Illyra agreed, and within the hour, she found herself traveling alongside the relief party, wrapped in far warmer clothing than she had worn on her wedding night, her practical knowledge of human survival techniques proving unexpectedly valuable as they navigated toward the isolated village. When they arrived at Hollow Pines, they found conditions worse than reported, several homes with roofs beginning to buckle under the weight of accumulated snow, families huddled together for warmth as their firewood supplies dwindled toward nothing. Illyra moved among the villagers with a confidence that surprised the wolves accompanying her, showing them how to properly insulate windows against drafts, using techniques common in her home village, but unfamiliar to wolves, who rarely needed such careful attention to warmth, given their natural resistance to cold. She organized the distribution of supplies with practical efficiency, ensuring that families with young children received priority access to the warmest shelters, and worked alongside the relief party late into the evening, helping clear snow from roofs threatening to collapse, her hands raw and cold despite thick gloves, but her determination unwavering. An elderly woman among the villagers, watching Alira work with quiet astonishment, finally approached Kale as evening settled over the rescue efforts. "Is it true," the woman asked, "that your Luna is the same bride who nearly died in your own courtyard weeks ago?" "The story has traveled even this far, my lord." "It is true," Kale confirmed, watching Alira help a young mother settle her children into a warmer shelter. "Then she understands something many of your wolves have never needed to learn," the old woman said. "She understands what it means to nearly lose everything to the cold, and she has chosen to spend that hard-won knowledge helping others survive the same danger, rather than simply being grateful for her own escape. That is the mark of someone who deserves to stand beside a king, my lord, regardless of what blood runs through her veins." Word of Alira's efforts at Hollow Pines spread quickly through Draven territory in the days that followed, carried by grateful villagers and impressed wolves alike, and Alira noticed, upon returning to the castle, a subtle but unmistakable shift in how the pack's remaining council members and servants treated her. The suspicion and quiet resentment that had lingered since her arrival, the sense that she remained an outsider tolerated rather than truly welcomed, began to soften into something closer to genuine respect. Mira, who had accompanied the relief party as one of Alira's personal attendants, watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, having grown close to Alira over the weeks since that terrible wedding night. Their bond forged initially through crisis but deepened, since then, through countless smaller moments of trust and kindness. "They are starting to see what I saw that first night," Mira said to Alira, as they returned to the warmth of the castle after the exhausting journey to Hollow Pines, "that you are stronger than anyone expected, and that this pack is fortunate to have you as their Luna, regardless of where you were born." "I could not have survived any of this without you," Alira said, squeezing Mira's hand gratefully. "Not that first night, and not the weeks since. You saved my life, Mira, and I will never forget that, regardless of what titles or positions either of us holds within this castle." Kale had already ensured that Mira's courage that terrible night would not go unrewarded, elevating her from her previous position as a general servant to a formal role as Alira's personal attendant, with privileges and compensation reflecting the debt the entire pack owed her for her quick action. But the gratitude Alira expressed personally, the genuine friendship that had grown between them despite the difference in their positions, meant more to Mira than any formal reward the king could offer. As winter began, slowly, to loosen its grip on Draven territory, and the immediate dangers that had defined Alira's first months as Luna finally seemed to fade into memory, she found herself increasingly comfortable in the role she had once accepted, only out of obligation. The castle that had nearly killed her had become, through countless small moments of connection and demonstrated loyalty, something she was beginning to genuinely think of as home. Spring arrived slowly across the northern territory, the snow retreating first from the lower valleys, before finally releasing its grip on the higher ground surrounding Draven Castle, and with the changing season, came a proposal from the Pack Council that surprised Alira when Kale first mentioned it to her. "The council wishes to hold a formal coronation," he explained, as they walked together through the castle gardens, newly free of snow, and beginning to show the first hints of green beneath winter's retreat. "A proper ceremony, recognizing you as Luna, separate from the wedding itself, which many feel was overshadowed by everything that followed it." Alira considered this carefully, remembering the cold, hollow ceremony that had marked her wedding, so different from anything she had imagined as a young girl dreaming of her future. "Do you think it matters?" she asked, holding a second ceremony, "when the first one nearly cost me my life?" "I think," Kale said carefully, "that it matters because it offers you the chance to begin again, on your own terms this time, with a pack that has come to genuinely respect you, rather than merely tolerate you as a political necessity. The wedding was forced upon both of us by circumstances neither of us chose. This coronation could be something different, something that reflects what we have built together since that terrible night, rather than what was imposed upon us before we ever knew each other." Alira found herself smiling at this, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest at the thought of a ceremony that would celebrate not obligation, but the relationship that had grown, slowly and unexpectedly, from the ashes of that obligation. "I would like that," she said. "Very much." The preparations for the coronation consumed the following weeks, and Alira found herself, for the first time since her arrival at Draven Castle, genuinely excited, rather than anxious, about an upcoming ceremony. Mira helped her select a gown far more suited to the northern climate than her original wedding dress had been, warm, without sacrificing elegance, in a deep blue that reminded Alira of the winter sky on clear nights, a color she had come to associate, strangely, with resilience rather than fear. Word of the coronation spread throughout Draven territory, and villagers from across the region, including several families from Hollow Pines who remembered Alira's efforts during the blizzard, made plans to travel to the castle for the ceremony, eager to witness the formal recognition of a Luna who had already proven her worth through action, rather than simply through the accident of her birth. Callan, overseeing security preparations for the large gathering the coronation would draw, approached Kale several days before the ceremony with news that added an unexpected layer of complication to the celebrations. "Celine has requested permission to attend," Callan reported, his expression carefully neutral. "She claims she wishes only to witness the ceremony from a distance, without approaching either you or Alira directly, as a demonstration of acceptance for the judgment you rendered against her." Kale's expression hardened immediately. "Her banishment was permanent," he said. "I do not see why I should reconsider that judgment, simply because she has requested an exception for a single day. I do not necessarily recommend granting her request," Callan said carefully. "I only wished you to be aware of it before making a final decision, given that Alira may have her own thoughts on the matter." When Kale brought this news to Alira that evening, expecting her to share his immediate rejection of the request, he found her reaction more thoughtful than he anticipated. "What do you think she truly wants?" Alira asked, considering the request carefully. "Forgiveness? Or simply the chance to see what she lost?" "I do not know," Kale admitted, "and I am not certain it matters. She nearly killed you, Alira. I do not feel obligated to grant her anything beyond the mercy I already showed, by choosing banishment rather than more severe punishment." "You are right that it does not matter what she wants," Alira said slowly, "but I find myself wondering what allowing her to attend, from a distance, watching me stand before this pack as their Luna, might mean, not for her sake, but for mine. There is a difference between hiding from someone who wronged you and standing confidently before them, unafraid, having survived, and even thrived, despite everything they tried to take from you." Kale studied her carefully, understanding, slowly, what she was suggesting. "You wish to grant her request." "I wish to show her," Alira said, "and everyone else who doubted whether I belonged in this pack, exactly how thoroughly her plan failed. Let her watch from whatever distance you deem safe. Let her see me crowned as Luna, surrounded by a pack that has come to respect me, celebrating a life she tried to end. There is a kind of justice in that, I think, more meaningful than simply keeping her away entirely." Kale considered this for a long moment, before finally nodding, moved by the strength he saw in his wife's reasoning, a strength that continued to surprise him, even after months of watching her navigate every challenge this pack and this territory had presented her. "I will allow it," he said, "under close guard, and at a distance that ensures she poses no genuine threat. But you should know, Alira, that you owe her nothing, not even the opportunity to witness your triumph. If you would rather she remain excluded entirely, I will honor that decision without question." "I know," Alira said, "but I think I would rather she see it. I think I need her to see it, for my own sake as much as any lesson it might teach her." The day of the coronation arrived bright and clear, the first truly warm day of the emerging spring, and the courtyard where Alira had once nearly died had been transformed entirely, filled now with flowers and banners and the assembled crowds of Draven territory, come to witness their Luna's formal recognition. Alira stood at the entrance to the great hall, dressed in her deep blue gown, watching through a narrow window as the crowd gathered below, and felt Mira's steady presence beside her, offering quiet encouragement as the moment approached. "Are you ready?" Mira asked. "I think I have been ready for this moment, since the night you found me in that courtyard," Alira said, Everything since then has simply been the path toward standing here today. She walked through the great hall alone, her chin lifted, her steps steady and confident, past rows of pack members who had once questioned whether she belonged among them, and now watched her with genuine respect and, in many cases, open admiration. She saw old Nora near the front, her weathered face creased with pride. She saw the elderly woman from Hollow Pines who had spoken so warmly of her efforts during the blizzard. She saw Callan, standing at attention near the dais, his expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man who had fought hard to ensure this moment could happen. And at the very edge of the courtyard, kept carefully distant by 2 watchful guards, she saw Celine, her expression unreadable, watching the ceremony unfold with an intensity that suggested she understood, finally and completely, exactly how thoroughly her scheme had failed. Alira met her eyes briefly across the crowded courtyard, holding the gaze for a long moment, neither triumphant nor cruel, simply steady and unafraid, before turning her attention forward, toward Cale, who stood waiting at the dais with an expression of open pride that made her breath catch despite everything she had already survived to reach this moment. The pack elder presiding over the ceremony, an old wolf named Bertram who had served the Draven family for decades, called for silence as Alira ascended the steps to stand beside her king. "We gather today," Bertram announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "not merely to crown a Luna, but to recognize a woman who has proven, through courage and sacrifice and genuine care for this territory and its people, that she belongs among us as fully as any wolf born within these lands. Alira of Ashcombe has survived what should have killed her, has protected villagers who needed her help during the harshest storm this territory has seen in years, and has faced down conspiracy and danger with a bravery that many wolves twice her strength could not have matched. She has earned this crown, not through the accident of her marriage, but through everything she has chosen to become since that marriage began." Cale turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his expression carrying a warmth and certainty that had grown, steadily and genuinely, from the cautious strangers who had stood together on their wedding day months before. "Alira," he said, his voice pitched for her alone, though it carried clearly through the silent courtyard. "When we married, I knew nothing about you beyond the necessity of a treaty neither of us chose. I did not expect to find, in the woman I married out of obligation, someone whose courage would humble me, whose kindness would transform how this entire pack understands what it means to be Luna, and whose presence in my life has become something I can no longer imagine living without. I crown you today not simply as my wife, but as a partner I have come to trust completely, and a woman I am proud to call the true Luna of Draven territory." He placed the ceremonial crown, a delicate circlet of silver worked with symbols representing both wolf and human heritage, carefully upon her head, and the assembled crowd erupted into celebration, cheers and howls rising together in a chorus that echoed off the castle walls and out across the surrounding hills. Alira felt tears gathering in her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, as she looked out over the crowd that had gathered to celebrate her survival and her strength, remembering, with vivid clarity, the terrible cold and isolation of that first night, and understanding, fully and completely, just how far she had traveled from that frightened woman, huddled against stone walls, with no one coming to help her. Everyone had come, eventually, and now, standing crowned before an entire territory that had learned to see her true worth, she understood that she had not simply survived her arrival at Draven Castle. She had transformed it. In the weeks following the coronation, life at Draven Castle settled into a rhythm that Alira had never dared hope for during those first terrifying days after her arrival. She spent her mornings working alongside old Nora in the healing chambers, learning the Wolfpack's traditional remedies while sharing knowledge of human medicine that Nora found genuinely fascinating, the 2 women forming an unlikely friendship built on mutual curiosity and respect. Her afternoons often found her in the castle's growing library, where she had begun compiling a record of practical survival knowledge from her homeland, determined that no one within Draven territory would ever again lack the information needed to survive a harsh winter, whether human or wolf. Cale, for his part, found himself increasingly drawn to these quiet moments of domestic life, moments he had never expected to value so deeply when he first accepted the terms of the treaty that brought Alira into his life. He began joining her in the library some evenings, ostensibly to review pack matters but often simply to sit near her, watching her work with a quiet contentment that surprised even him. "You seem different lately," Callan observed one evening, finding Cale in an unusually relaxed mood as they reviewed routine pack business. "Less guarded, perhaps. I do not believe I have seen you smile this often since before your father's death." Cale considered this observation carefully before responding. "I did not expect to find happiness in this marriage," he admitted. "I expected duty, and perhaps, eventually, a comfortable partnership built on mutual respect. I did not expect to find someone whose presence makes even difficult days feel lighter, simply by being near her." "Your father would have been pleased," Callan said quietly. "He always believed that the strongest partnerships were built through shared hardship, rather than easy circumstance. I imagine he would have seen exactly what you have found in Illyra, and recognized it as something rare." Illyra, meanwhile, had begun receiving regular correspondence from her father in Hollowmere, his letters growing warmer and more personal as the months passed, filled with genuine curiosity about her life in the north, and evident relief that the treaty their families had arranged had grown into something far more meaningful than either of them had initially dared hope. He wrote of Lord Edric's trial, which had concluded with a sentence of permanent imprisonment rather than execution, a mercy extended in recognition of the family ties between them, despite the severity of his betrayal. "I am glad they chose mercy," Illyra told Cale, reading her father's most recent letter by the fire in their private chambers. "Not because Edric deserves forgiveness, but because I do not think vengeance would have brought me any genuine peace. I have all that I need now, without requiring his suffering to complete it." "You are remarkably generous," Cale observed, "toward people who tried to destroy your life." "I do not think of it as generosity," Illyra said thoughtfully. "I think of it as refusing to let their cruelty define the rest of my own story. I survived them. I built something better than what they tried to take from me. That victory feels more complete than any punishment I might have demanded instead." As summer approached, and the territory around Draven Castle bloomed fully into its warmer season, Illyra found herself, one quiet morning, experiencing an unfamiliar wave of nausea that old Nora, upon careful examination, identified with a knowing smile that made Illyra's heart leap with sudden, overwhelming understanding. "You are with child," Nora confirmed, watching Illyra's expression shift through surprise, joy, and a touch of nervous uncertainty in quick succession. "Early yet, but unmistakable. You should tell the king immediately. I imagine he will want to know as soon as possible." Illyra found Cale in the castle courtyard, the same courtyard where her ordeal had begun so many months before, now transformed by summer into a space filled with flowering vines and the warm scent of blooming gardens, rather than the cold terror she still occasionally remembered in quiet moments. She had chosen this location deliberately, wanting to share this news in a place that represented, now, everything they had overcome together, rather than the fear that had once defined it. "I have news," she said, and something in her voice made Cale set aside the reports he had been reviewing immediately, giving her his full attention. "You seem nervous," he observed carefully. "Is something wrong?" "No," Illyra said, a smile breaking through her careful composure. "Nothing is wrong at all. I am expecting a child, Cale. Our child." The transformation in Cale's expression was immediate and unmistakable, surprise giving way almost instantly to a joy so profound that Illyra found herself laughing at the sight of her composed, authoritative husband, suddenly looking as overwhelmed and delighted as any new father might. "A child," he repeated, as though testing the reality of the words. He crossed the distance between them quickly, pulling her carefully into his arms, mindful of a new fragility he had not needed to consider before this moment. "Illyra, this is—" He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to the emotion overwhelming him. "This is everything I did not know I wanted, until this exact moment." News of the pregnancy spread through Draven territory with the same speed that had once carried word of Illyra's near death in the courtyard, though this time the message carried joy rather than horror, celebration rather than crisis. The pack, having watched Illyra transform from a reluctant political bride into a Luna who had earned genuine respect through courage and compassion, welcomed the news of an heir with an enthusiasm that would have seemed impossible during those first uncertain weeks after her arrival. Even old Nora, typically reserved in her expressions of emotion, found herself unexpectedly moved as she monitored Illyra's pregnancy through the following months, watching the young woman she had nursed back from the edge of death, now carrying new life within her. a powerful symbol, Nora often thought privately, of how thoroughly cruelty could be answered not with more cruelty, but with resilience and growth that ultimately outshone every attempt to destroy it. The months of pregnancy passed with their own challenges and joys, Illyra navigating the physical demands of carrying a child whose wolf heritage occasionally manifested in unexpected ways that even Nora, with her decades of experience, found herself needing to research and understand more carefully. But through it all, Cale remained a constant, steady presence, attending to her needs with a devotion that had grown, organically and genuinely, from the fierce protectiveness he had first discovered on the night he carried her, half frozen, from the courtyard where she had nearly died. Winter returned to Draven territory as Illyra's pregnancy neared its final weeks, the seasons having turned full circle since that first terrible night, nearly a year before, and Illyra found herself watching the falling snow from her chambers, with feelings far more complicated than simple fear this time, a mixture of nostalgia for how far she had traveled, and lingering unease about a season that still carried difficult memories. "Does the snow still frighten you?" Cale asked one evening, finding her at the window, one hand resting on the curve of her belly as she watched the flakes drift past the glass. "Not the way it once did," Illyra admitted. "I think I have made peace with winter, mostly. Though I will admit, I feel a certain relief knowing our child will be born inside these walls, surrounded by warmth and protection, rather than facing the kind of night I once faced alone." "That will never happen to our child," Cale said, his voice carrying the same absolute certainty she had come to rely on completely. "Nor to anyone else who comes under this pack's protection, so long as I hold this title. What happened to you taught this entire territory a lesson it will not soon forget." The birth, when it finally came, arrived earlier than expected, on a night when a sudden storm rolled down from the mountains with a ferocity that reminded everyone in the castle, uncomfortably, of the conditions that had nearly claimed Illyra's life the previous year. Old Nora attended the birth personally, assisted by 2 younger healers, while Cale remained close at hand, his composed authority stretched thin by a fear more personal and more overwhelming than anything he had faced during his years as Alpha King. The labor proved difficult, longer and more demanding than Nora had anticipated, complications arising from the unusual nature of a pregnancy blending human and wolf heritage in ways that even the experienced healer had never encountered so directly. There was a stretch of hours, deep in the night, when Illyra's strength began to falter, when her breathing grew ragged and her responses grew slow, and when Nora's expression, usually so composed and reassuring, began to show genuine concern. Cale, pacing outside the birthing chamber, felt the weight of that long night in the courtyard return to him with unwelcome familiarity, the same helpless terror of nearly losing the woman who had become essential to everything he valued in his life. When Callan found him there, hours into the ordeal, he found a king far more shaken than the composed ruler who had delivered judgment before the Pack Council months before. "She survived that courtyard when no one believed she could," Callan said quietly, understanding exactly what fears were consuming his king. "She has proven, repeatedly, that she is stronger than anyone expects. Trust that strength now, as you have trusted it before." Cale held on to those words through the remaining hours of the difficult labor, and when dawn finally broke over Draven territory, gray light filtering through clouds still heavy with the last traces of the passing storm, the sound of a newborn's cry finally reached the corridor where he waited, followed shortly by Nora's exhausted but genuinely relieved voice calling him into the chamber. Illyra lay propped against pillows, pale and exhausted but unmistakably alive, unmistakably present, cradling a small bundle against her chest with an expression of overwhelming, exhausted joy that made Cale's careful composure finally break entirely as he crossed the room to kneel beside the bed. "A daughter," Illyra said softly, her voice hoarse from the long hours of labor, but filled with a warmth that eclipsed any exhaustion. "Cale, we have a daughter." Cale looked down at the small face peering up from the blankets, tiny features that seemed to carry traces of them both, and felt something within him settle into place with a certainty that no political treaty, no formal ceremony, no crown could have provided. This was the family he had never expected to find in a marriage born from obligation and treaty, a family that had grown, against every expectation, from the ashes of a wedding night that should have ended in tragedy, instead of the beginning of everything that mattered most to him now. "She is beautiful," he said softly, reaching out with careful, reverent hands to touch his daughter's small fingers, as beautiful as her mother. They named her Wren, after the small, resilient birds that survived even the harshest northern winters, through sheer determination and adaptability, qualities that Alira had come to embody so completely during her own difficult journey into this family, this territory, this life she had never expected to choose for herself, but had ultimately grown to love with her whole heart. News of the birth spread through Draven territory with the same speed that had once carried news of crisis and conspiracy, though this time, the celebration that followed carried none of the fear and uncertainty that had marked Alira's earlier months in her new home. Villagers from across the territory, including several families from Hollow Pines who had never forgotten Alira's efforts during that severe blizzard, sent gifts and well wishes for the newborn heir, a testament to how completely Alira had earned her place within this community that had once viewed her with such deep suspicion. Even word from Hollowmere brought warmth rather than danger this time. Alira's father, writing with genuine joy about the birth of his first grandchild, expressing hope that he might soon travel north to meet her in person, a journey he had been reluctant to undertake during the earlier months of political tension, but now looked forward to with unreserved eagerness. As Alira recovered from the birth in the weeks that followed, spending long, contented hours nursing her daughter beside the fire in chambers that had become genuinely, completely her own, she found herself reflecting often on the journey that had brought her to this moment, from a frightened bride locked outside in a deadly storm, to a Luna who had earned the genuine respect and love of an entire territory, to now, a mother cradling a daughter who would grow up knowing nothing of the fear and uncertainty that had defined her own arrival in this place, only the warmth and protection and love that Alira and Kale had built together, deliberately and carefully, from everything that had once threatened to destroy them both. Nearly a year after Wren's birth, as Draven territory settled into another turn of the seasons, a letter arrived at the castle that gave Alira pause, forwarded from the small border settlement where Celine had been permitted to establish a quiet, monitored existence following her banishment. It was the first communication Celine had attempted since the coronation, and Alira read it twice before deciding whether to share its contents with Kale. The letter contained no excuses, no attempts to minimize what Celine had done or shift blame elsewhere, a departure from the defensive posture she had maintained throughout her trial before the Pack Council. Instead, it offered something Alira had not expected, a genuine, unadorned apology, along with an account of how the intervening months in exile had forced Celine to confront the full weight of what her jealousy and cruelty had nearly cost, not only Alira, but the entire territory she claimed to love. "I do not ask for forgiveness," the letter read, "because I do not believe I have earned it, and perhaps never will. I ask only that you know I understand, now, fully and completely, the difference between the woman I believed myself to be and the woman my actions revealed me to be that night. I have had a great deal of time to sit with that difference, alone, and it has changed me in ways I did not expect exile to accomplish. I wish you and your daughter every happiness the world can offer, happiness I forfeited any claim to when I chose cruelty over honor." Alira showed the letter to Kale that evening, watching his expression carefully as he read it, uncertain how he would respond to this unexpected gesture, from a woman who had once been among his closest companions, before her jealousy had driven her to such extreme cruelty. "Do you believe her?" Kale asked finally, setting the letter aside. "I believe," Alira said carefully, "that genuine remorse and continued exile are not mutually exclusive. I do not think this letter changes what she did, or the punishment that fit it. But I think it speaks to something worth acknowledging, that people can recognize their own worst moments clearly, even if that recognition comes too late to undo the harm already caused." "Do you wish to respond?" Kale asked. Alira considered this for a long moment before answering. "I think I will," she said. Not to invite her back into our lives, or to suggest that what happened is forgotten, but simply to acknowledge that I received her words, and that I hope whatever she builds for herself in exile brings her toward becoming someone genuinely worthy of the respect she once held in this pack, even if that path never leads her back to Draven territory. She wrote a brief, careful response, acknowledging Celine's letter without extending false warmth or suggesting any path toward reconciliation, beyond what her exile already represented, closing the correspondence with a simple statement that she hoped Celine's future choices would honor the lesson her past mistakes had taught her so painfully. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was not bitterness either, a measured acknowledgement that allowed Alira to close that chapter of her life with dignity, rather than lingering resentment. Mira, meanwhile, had grown into her role as Alira's trusted attendant, with a confidence and warmth that had earned her genuine respect throughout the castle, and had begun, over the past year, a quiet courtship with one of Callan's most trusted guards, a steady young wolf named Otto who had, coincidentally, been among the guards who first testified against Garrett's scheme during the initial investigation, his honesty during that difficult period earning him a promotion, and, eventually, an introduction to Mira that had blossomed into something neither of them had expected. "I never imagined finding happiness through such a terrible night," Mira confided to Alira one afternoon, as they sat together in the castle gardens watching Wren take her first uncertain steps across the grass under Kale's careful supervision. "But I suppose good things can grow from even the worst circumstances, if enough people choose courage over fear when it matters most." "I think that has been the story of this entire past year," Alira agreed, watching her daughter stumble and laugh in Kale's steady arms, as he caught her before she could fall. Terrible circumstances, met with enough courage and loyalty to transform them into something none of us could have predicted when that first cruel night began. As Wren grew from an infant into an energetic toddler, filling the halls of Draven Castle with laughter that seemed to erase, more completely with each passing month, the shadow of fear that had once defined Alira's earliest experiences in her new home. Kale found himself reflecting often on how thoroughly his understanding of love and partnership had transformed since that terrible wedding night. He had entered this marriage believing duty and obligation were the only foundations available to him, given the political necessity that had arranged it. He had not anticipated that duty could grow, through shared hardship and demonstrated loyalty, into something as profound and complete as what he now shared with Alira, a partnership built not on the accident of an arranged treaty, but on everything they had chosen to build together in the aftermath of nearly losing each other before their story had even properly begun. On the anniversary of their wedding, as the first snows of another winter began to dust the courtyard where Alira had once nearly died, Kale found her standing at the same spot along the wall where he had discovered her that terrible night, her expression thoughtful rather than fearful, watching the snow fall with the calm of someone who had long since made peace with the memory this place still carried. "I still think about that night sometimes," she admitted, when he came to stand beside her. "Not with the same fear I once felt, but with a kind of gratitude, strange as that may sound. Everything that matters most to me now grew from what happened here." "I think about it too," Kale admitted, "though for me, it remains mostly a reminder of how close I came to losing you, before I ever understood what you would come to mean to me." He drew her carefully into his arms, mindful of the small, sleeping shape she carried against her shoulder, their second child, born only months before, a son this time, whose arrival had completed their family in ways neither of them had dared imagine during those uncertain early days of their arranged marriage. "Thank you," Alira said quietly, resting her head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek, "for coming back for me that night, and for every night since." "Always," Kale said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head, "for as long as I live, and beyond, if such a thing is possible." "You are not simply my wife, Alira. You are the reason I understand, now, what it truly means to be an Alpha King, not merely someone who commands through strength, but someone who protects, absolutely, and without exception, everyone who depends on that protection, beginning with the person who matters most to him in all the world." Snow continued to fall gently around them, transforming the courtyard once again into something quiet and peaceful, the same space that had once witnessed such profound cruelty, now serving as a testament to how thoroughly love and loyalty could transform even the darkest circumstances into something worth treasuring. Inside the castle, warm light spilled from every window, and somewhere within those walls, their daughter slept soundly in a nursery filled with everything a child could need to feel safe and loved, a stark and deliberate contrast to the cold, locked courtyard her mother had once faced entirely alone. They had left the new bride freezing in the snow all night, believing her survival mattered less than their own resentments and ambitions, but the Alpha King had carried her inside, and in doing so, had begun a story that neither cruelty nor conspiracy nor the harshest winter this territory had ever seen, could ultimately unmake. What grew from that terrible night was not simply survival, but a family, a partnership, and a Luna, whose strength had transformed an entire pack's understanding of what it truly meant to belong. And as winter settled once more over Draven Castle, warm light glowing steadily from every window against the gathering dark, Elira understood, completely and without doubt, that whatever storms still waited in the years ahead, she would never again face them alone.